Good afternoon everybody, Joe Pal Martin Metalhead here, hope you're going well. Today I'm going to do a different type of vlog. Well, it's going to be like at home, but it's going to be me reading from a previous blog post that I wrote on my old website, overlandmetalhead.com, 6 years ago in 2019. This was all about my Melbourne life in Australia in 2016, when I finally made it to Melbourne after 30 years in Australia. I was there for about, 2 months. I wouldn't really say a full 2 months, but yes, but I had 2 months living in Melbourne, Australia, before I left Melbourne due to an illness I had, which was a really stressful time in my life. And that would end up to me like leaving Australia at the end of 2016, and how I have not been back to Australia since then. Okay, so I wrote this up on my website, Overland Metalhead 2019, but then, I got it on my blog about 5 years ago because I wasn't making any money out of it. But I thought, well, maybe I'll still continue my YouTube channel under a different name, Martin Metalhead. So this is why I decided to basically sit down and read this blog post that I wrote. I've been away from Australia for close to 3 years. I've been residing in the UK since July 2015, if you disregard my 16 months in total away from the UK in the last 4 years. But one thing I've never written about was the close to 2 months I spent in the Victoria capital of Melbourne. In March 2016, I had a week off work from that 0-hour contract job at the Catholic Function Centre in Western Sydney. I secured a ticket to attend the filming of Rock Quiz. I always wanted to be in the audience for the show, and I was lucky to get a ticket. The only downer was the recording was done in Melbourne, a town I'd never ever set foot in my 30 years of life in Australia. Even though I was born in that disgusting shithole imperialist white-run no-fares island of Australia, I hardly saw much of my own country of birth. I spent 28 years residing in the same house in Baulkham Hills from age 2 in 1988 to age 30 in April 2016. I lived all my life within the suburbs of Western Sydney. I worked in the Sydney CBD a few times. I took a bus down to Canberra in the Snowy Mountains aged 12 in 1998. I went to Brisbane to see my older brother in 2005. I took many trips to Canberra between 2009 and 2010 to see Lord and Hellbringer. I visited my father in Cairns 7 times in 8 years. I flew to Darwin on Christmas Day 2014 to board a plane to Timor-Leste. But never in my entire life had I ever been to Melbourne. I also never set foot in Western Australia, Tasmania, and South Australia, so that's pretty much 4 out of 7 of Australia that I've seen. One day in March, I took a cheap overnight train from Sydney Central Station all the way to the Southern Cross Station in Melbourne. 12 hours it takes to travel between the 2 big cities by rail or road. If you hate overlanding, then it's a 1.8-hour flight. On my first trip to Melbourne, I visited the War Memorial, had lunch with my New Zealand cousin in the CBD, walked through the MCG where AFL and cricket are being played, took a train south to Springvale to visit a few Commonwealth war graves, visited the Parliament of Victoria. I found Melbourne to be a cool city, but it was also full of hipsters. Not that I have anything against hipsters. And at the time of my life, I was kind of happy having a ticket to see King Diamond in London, a flight booked to Manila in May, and I had a good paying casual job in my hometown Sydney. Then all of a sudden, things really become shit for me. I moved to Britain in April 2016 and I left 2 months later. After turbulent times in the UK, not getting a job, being xenophobic to my Eastern European housemates, the height of the EU referendum, and prospective employer in Berkshire, I ended up back in Cairns, Australia on the 12th of July 2016. I went back to my dad's house in Cairns to wait for a few things, waiting to get back on the New Start allowance, aka the unemployment dole, waiting for my 2015-2016 tax return to arrive on my bank account. I could have just stayed in Cairns, got a job, and just lived an Australian life, and accepted that I would never get to live in the UK again because I blame EU migrants for taking my jobs. My father said that if I was to live in his unit long term, I would be like dead fish. Living with an elderly person who was single and alone really bugs the shit out of them. Plus my dad was spewing that I never tried to live in London. After 2 weeks in Cairns, I decided to fly to Melbourne and just start up from there. I booked a week's accommodation at Pint on Punt Hostel in St Kilda. Flying into Melbourne that day, I was reading over the famous Mikey travel card. I took a cheap bus from the airport to get out to the Melbourne railway system. By the time I was walking towards St Kilda, I was calling up a lady in Flemington. She wanted me to stay at her house for 8 weeks for 900 Australian dollars. I told her I'd move in a week later. I paid around 140 Aussie dollars for a week's accommodation at this hostel in St Kilda. I moved into a 4-dorm bedroom that had 3 other English lads. Being the only Australian-born person in this room made it a bit of a laughing stock. These English guys were on working holiday visas, earning big doughs, doing jobs that I never thought I'd be doing. Since I'd been to 49 nations at the time, in July 2016, all 3 English lads were stoked how I was able to get to half a century of nations. They all thought I had a rich parents or had a wealthy dead grandma. These lads were all full of stories. One of the men told me that his stepsister got pregnant when he first met her, but she aborted the baby. He said it didn't count as incest as there was no blood relations. I told these guys a story about how I abandoned to live in the UK in June 2013 so I could return to Australia and have sex with a mature escort. They were all laughing their heads off. "You came back to Oz so you could fuck a prosy, mate," said the man on the bottom bunk. I told these guys the name of a porn star escort called Mia Monroe who would charge $500 a fuck for half an hour. Then I mentioned there were wannabe porn stars working at the private club in Aston. I even told them a story about how I went to Montreal in May 2010 to meet porn star Carol Cox, but spent all day jacking off in the bathroom when she turned me down. "You were jacking off in the sink all day!" They all found it hilarious. They all called me Screech, just like that dingbat from Saved by the Bell. During my week in Pinnacle Hospital, I gained my Victorian RSA certificate so I could serve alcohol. I did working with children's check. I asked for my old job back at Pinnacle People in Melbourne as I worked in Sydney. It was easy to get my old job at Pinnacle People back, but everything in the Sydney office said got lost in translation. The wankers at the Melbourne office told me that how I had 2 awesome reviews from all the hard work I did in Sydney. You got to remember that in Sydney I sold chips at the NRL Grand Final, I sold beer at Fleetwood Mac, I sold hot dogs at Test Cricket and Big Bash Leagues, beer at the Rugby Sevens tournament, burgers at Madonna, chips in Kevin Hart. So if I was able to work at all these great events in Sydney, then I should be able to repeat the same formula in Melbourne. I moved into a house at 117 Princess Street in Flemington. I was north of the Melbourne CBD, only a few minutes by train or tram to the heart of Melbourne. I paid $900 for 8 weeks of rent plus 1 week's deposit. I was the only Australian-born person in this house. From what I remember, there was a Venezuelan anime living in the first room, a Colombian guy living in the second room. The third bedroom was basically a dormitory room. There were 12 beds in this one room. The house had 2 bathrooms, a big kitchen table. It was 3 months since I walked out of Smithic shithole thanks to a Romanian Polish male flatmate complaining about room and body odours. Being the only Australian-born person in this house, I was really worried about repeating my bad actions. So every day I took a shower, and every 2 days I did my laundry. When you move cities, all the things in your life change. I had to find a new doctor in Melbourne to dispense my medication. There were no bulk billings at GPs in Melbourne City, so I had to settle for a super clinic in Moody Ponds, north of my house in Flemington. Moody Ponds Surgical Centre, avoid at all costs. I go in there while I was living in Pint and Punt. I see this Dr. Didi who shouldn't even be practicing with Australia. I showed her all my medical records from Sydney. I told her all the medicines I take. I took the prescriptions to the chemist. All they gave me was the bare minimum. I grew up with 3 bottles of Cortate in every repeat and 2 inhalers you push down on. I only got 1 bottle of Cortate and 2 inhalers I never use. I'm due for an injection and once on the 29th of July. I show up that day and the pricks at Moody Pond Medical Centre tell me that my appointment is on the 29th of August. I just need to see a nurse to stick an injection into my arse. I called my GP in Borkham Hills and they told me these differents in Melbourne can't give me the right amount of medication because they don't know me well. I told my GP that I'd be back up in a few weeks. Due to the fact that my job at Pinnacle People gave me a 0-hour contract, I had to abide by the rules of New Style Allowance, meaning reporting weekly income into some sort of job centre type of office to tell them what I was doing. I had to do a lot of this in Sydney, even when I was working. Back in Australia, you could work part-time and still get New Style Allowance. It wasn't called double dipping. All you had to do was report to Centrelink the hours you worked and the money you earned before tax. The dole reporter worked out how much you can get paid, depending on your earnings. So if you did fuck all work in 2 weeks, it's $550 from the government. In this job centre called direct recruitment, I had a lady bitching about my CV structure. Like, come on you stupid cow, I've gained job interviews with the CV, so you go fuck yourself. The fuckwits at direct recruitment trying to drop into a work for the dole, despite the fact I've been abroad for the last 3 months and just resumed my life in Australia. I last did work for the dole in 2007. It was what I wanted to do as it gave me a job to get out of bed and to go feed the homeless in Parramatta. 9 years later they were wanting me to cut down trees. The government has sent me to job service providers in Melbourne District Recruit. Like the pricks whom I dealt with at Breakthrough People Solutions, Mission Australia, Nova Employment, Wise Employment. These cunts gave me no help at all. Their computers were broken and the staff was stuck on naive dicks. So I transferred myself to another job search provider in the same town I lived in, Flemington. I was doing my job at Pinnacle People in the first week of August, but this dumb immigrant Mary was calling me to do a job that started in 90 minutes. So I had to go from my house in Flemington to the Pinnacle People office to buy a shitty uniform and go all the way to a glorious private school in Melbourne Girls Grammar to clean the kitchen with an Irish chef. I'd be sent out to this stupid private school to clean its kitchen. I just didn't understand that being in Melbourne I wasn't getting asked to work at AFL and NRL games. It was football season. And if I was still in Sydney, sure I'd be working at the SCG, the SFS every few weekends. I needed to get another job so I could have a second income. On Saturday I went out to Live on Steak near Carlton to do a trials. I was hoping to be eating a fresh start as a waiter, but because the owner saw me as a waiter with only 3 years experience, he gave me the cold shoulder and told me to leave. I ran to the steakhouse an hour later and told the Serbian owner to get fucked. I have nothing against Serbian people in the world, as I like the country, but yet again it was a case of a foreign owner refusing to give an Australian-born person a chance. A day later I was at Zoom Zoom Cafe in North Melbourne. The owner wouldn't give me a job at all because I didn't know how to clear plates. I had 2 interviews at 2 promising places in the south of Melbourne, but neither restaurant ever had the balls to get back to me or even write me a rejection letter. If you don't back to me a rejection letter, then you're a fuckhead. I went back to Sydney for the first time in 4 months during August 2016. I had to collect some stuff from my brother's house in the Hills District. My childhood friend Albert and his wife Navy allowed me to stay in their house in Strathfields. I came to Sydney on the morning train and had to go back down the following evening. In this 24-hour time frame, I paid for sex with a North Shore escort. $200 of taxpayers' money spent on a fucking mature age woman. This is what I do to get back at all the knobs who have rejected me over the years. This is the last time I had sex with this woman, as I've been visiting her since 2013. I told myself that if I ever moved back to England, I would claim JSA benefits and spend UTK tax monies on sex with porn stars. That day, I went back to see my Dr. Bob in Sydney. He was so furious that a doctor in Melbourne couldn't give me enough tablets for him to repeat. Dr. Bob said if you run out of your Cortec, your blood pressure will drop and you'll get really sick. I was so unhappy to walk out of this Bella Vista doctor's with a prescription that I could take across the New South Wales Victoria border and get a chemist to dispense it for me. I went back home that day to see my brothers, his children, and my mum. I was so excited to see my niece and nephews 4 months away from Sydney. I raced back to Melbourne that night so I could go to a job all the way out of Western Melbourne. I had worked at this public school doing a job I fucking hated. A week later, I was getting sent to do 2 jobs in one day. That African fuckwit Mary really started screwing around with me. The cunt cancelled all my shifts that week because of fuck-ups. So that week in Melbourne, I lost 24 hours of work. You times that by the casual Australian pay rate and look at what I should have earned. I even had easy work that involved going out and counting cars in the streets. It was cancelled. The worst thing you could do was get told to go to a job in Geelong, the other side of the bay, and be told on the train the job was been cancelled. So I went to Victoria Street Library to do things on my website. All of a sudden I was told to go to this online course and go work at Crown Casino. I had never wanted to work in a casino. It had been 10 years since I started the casino. Fuckwits didn't give me a job. As soon as I walked into the Crown Casino, I knew straight away casinos are a horrible place to work at. My mother told me this 10 years ago. My late grandmother was a blackjack dealer. I ever heard a female receptionist complaining to a co-worker about her personal life. I heard a few shit bombs being dropped. I had a hard time trying to get clothing for this job. I was hoping to work away at some function, but the co-manager working for Pinnacle People assisted me to be a kitchen porter. I was the only kitchen porter at Crown Casino to wear an apron and hat. The head kitchen porter in charge took a photograph of me on his smartphone and called me a puff and duff. I had no idea this was the name of a homosexual bar in Melbourne, but in my opinion, calling me that was homophobic, even though I am heterosexual. This shift was going to go from 8 PM to 4 AM in the morning. This is some hours that really go against my schedules. I have never worked past my bedtime. I found it stupid that all these kitchen porters had to put on gloves and put food in plates. I was called a puff and duff by a redhead fuckwit. He told me to relax. I told this knob, bitch, I have fucking anxiety. This is something I've always wanted to say. I called it quits on this job. I walked the fuck out and I was so damn angry at the bitch who put me on this job. I told her I wasn't going to be working as a kitchen porter anymore. Bitterness and disgust, I walked home and took the train back to my house. I told my Filipino housemate how disgusted I was to be called a puff and duff. All my housemates were furious at what had happened. So I got on the phone and reported the incident to Crown Casino. I was reporting 2 problems. 1. Homophobic slur used on a staff member who was heterosexual. 2. Having a receptionist swear on the job. The woman at Crown Casino was sorry to hear about my incidents. She passed on my details to the person in charge. The following week I spoke to the woman in charge and told her it was a bald, fat Asian Australian who called me a puff and duff at Crown Casino on the 25th of August, and there was also a male redhead chef. I said to the woman at the end of the phone, if this was Mogadishu and you called me a puff and duff, I'd bash the living shit out of that person. This was the only time in my life I had ever threatened somebody. Back in the day you could say, oh, I have friends in the African National Congress who can come over to your house and beat your racist ass to pulp. But these days, threatening to bash the shit out of a homophobe in Melbourne or an Uzbek terrorist in Stockholm can be seen as a threat. I escaped working at Crown Casino the following day. I was glad not to be working on that Saturday because I got to meet Stephen and Jess from Flying the Nest. I inspired those guys dearly, and so they influenced me a bit more. I last worked a day in Melbourne on the 30th of August. I told a Korean lady at the rich girls' school that I was not going to be a kitchen boy anymore. I spoke to a knobhead at Pinnacle People, and this cunt of a woman told me she had never laid eyes on my resume, despite the fact I delivered my resume to the stupid office on my first day in Melbourne. The cow told me that Pinnacle People in Melbourne doesn't work at sporting events, and if I wanted to do that work I should be enlisted spotless. I had worked for those spotless bastards in 2013 2014, and they were nothing more but retards who liked hiring immigrants over Australian-born people and not letting people move up. I started to become really sick that week. To start off with the flu, but the start of the following week I was going downhill. I was throwing up, I just couldn't keep my medicine down, I couldn't keep anything down. I went north to visit Dr. Didi and she just gave me vomiting and diarrhea medications. She told me vomiting and diarrhea can't be related to the flu. Taking these medicines made me hallucinate, meaning when I closed my eyes I could see various patterns. I called my mum in Sydney and she told me to go to the hospital and ask for a hydrocortisone injection. The truth is, if my body's throwing out my medicines, I have to have this injection. So I took a taxi to the Royal Melbourne Hospital and was admitted instantly to our operating room. My temperature was high, my blood pressure was high, I was dehydrated. My penis wasn't even producing erection. I knew I was on death's door. I pictured myself over the pearly gates drinking cider with Jackie Collins and Cliff Burton. I wasn't ready to leave this earth at age 30 years and 9 months. Some guy came into the room and gave me an IV drip. It had been 20 years since the last on a drip. 2 bags of IV fluids were made to rehydrate me. The GP asked me if I was British. I told him I was, but I was back in Australia because all these Eastern Europeans were taking my jobs. The doctor found me funny. Minutes later, a male Chinese nurse came to a room to inject hydrocortisone into my arm. 2 injections did the trick. I was so happy to be in this hospital. I was wheeled into a ward where IV fluids were pumped into my arm. I called my parents in both Cairns and Sydney to tell them where I was. Dad told me not to do any work until I got back to Sydney. Mum asked if my cousin Georgina should run me up some hydrolyte. I was discharged from hospital the following day. The next day I was summoned to go down the road to attend my stupid job center appointment. The lady called Zoe condemned me for not turning up with a doctor's note and for hanging up on a phone call. This bitch Zoe tried to get me a job at Crown Casino, but after homophobic slurs thrown at me and the threats of jihad thrown at Crown Casino, I bet I'll never set a toe in that shithole ever again. The following week I was getting called in to handyman work at Pinnacle People, even though I'd asked to work at the MCG. I was too scared to work a shift at the MCG due to all these ISIS threats that were getting around Melbourne, plus I was still feeling shit. One day I went out to have Chinese lunch with my cousin Georgina. I've seen her 3 times in Melbourne this year. I gave her some chocolates as a thank you for all the support she'd given me all this time in Melbourne. I felt glad that I was still sick, as this was a way I could get out of work. As I was living in this house in Melbourne, I really did get along with my housemates. I lived with people from Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Britain, Korea, and the Philippines. While as New Zealander moved to this house, he was an island savior to me. During my sick times, I used to think I had narcolepsy. It was my last few weeks in Melbourne that the Colombian housemate had been drinking his milk and stealing his food. One day, a police officer and a GP from a psycho hospital knocked on the door and asked if this man was still living here. The Kiwi guy asked me if we remembered him. I said this man appeared 3 weeks ago and asked me if I came, but the landlady said no. On the 20th of September 2016, I boarded a train back to Sydney. I was returned to my hometown after 5 months away. Left behind so much bullshit in Melbourne, I had been fucked around by Pinnacle People. Employers couldn't give me a job. Crown Casino was homophobic to a heterosexual man. The important thing was I lived in Melbourne, worked there, got along with my house, and it's better than the scum and Symmetric. Before I left Melbourne, I booked a one-way ticket to Hong Kong for $176 Australian dollars. I'd always dreamed about going to Hong Kong since a little boy. Since I was heading to the Kong, I decided to also be in best interest to get on the Trans-Siberian Railway in Vladivostok, as it had been the train I'd been wanting to take since 2006. My mother collected me from the shopping centre in Castle Hill and drove me to a friend's house down the road. It was good to be back in Sydney. She was shocked at the way I was looking. I hadn't eaten well in the past few weeks. My mum was house sitting in an Indian friend's parents' house while they were in Hawaii for the week. We had to look after the big dog called Tasha, who was 14 years old, while they were away. That weekend I went out to see Barstars at a club in Newtown. Guitarist Bill Morgan dedicated a song to Overland Metalhead. A week after I left Melbourne, I moved to a Chinese family house in Wellington Hills. I had my own room again. Mom bought me a lot of food that I kept in a box. She paid my rent for me. In return, I helped my mom move into a big house in the western suburbs of Sydney. 7 weeks after I left Melbourne, I flew out of Sydney, went to Hong Kong for 5 days before flying to Vladivostok and overlanding to London in 3 weeks and 2 days. I had moved back to the UK for the third time in less than 18 months. Since I resumed my life in the UK, there have been times I felt like I would give up a Brit and go back to Australia, but there's one thing for sure: I will never ever live in Melbourne ever again. Everyone at Pinnacle People, Lagat Steakhouse, Great Recruitment Spotless, we can all get fucked for all I care. It was during those 8 weeks living in a dormitory room in Flemington that inspired me to live a whole year in London hostel. So far I lived in 16 months in London hostels before finding my feet in my current North London home. This was written in like March 2019. So I lived in Melbourne. That was at the end of my 30 years in Australia, and I haven't been back to Australia since then. And honest to God, I don't think I could ever really plan to go back to Melbourne. Although it was nice just to go there in my Australian life. Anyway, this is Martin Metalhead, over and out.